Welcome once again to the Gaming News Canada show. As always, I'm your host, Steve McAllister. The third anniversary of Ontario's regulated sports wagering and online gaming marketplace on April 4th came and went without a whole lot of fanfare. The recently announced departure of Fitzgerald leaves the province's legal gaming industry with 50 operators, including the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation. It's been a while since we've gathered members of the Fourth Estate for a chinwag on this podcast. Given the Ontario market's anniversary and a few burning issues around the industry here, the Alberta government's recent introduction of the iGaming Alberta Act is the next step towards regulated gaming in that province, and a plethora of news out of the US right now, and that doesn't include Donald Trump's tariff tantrum. We figured the timing couldn't be better. So we welcome back to the show the editor-at-large for the Gaming News Canada newsletter, Dave Briggs, the senior news analyst for Covers, Geoff Zochodne, and making return after a very lengthy absence, the lead news writer for Catena's Media's bonus news outlet, Robyn McNeil. Hey, Robyn, I want to start with you. We joked before we hit the record button that we haven't had you on this forum since the early Clubhouse days when Gaming News Canada was called the Parlay. But so it's long overdue getting you back here on this podcast, and really glad to have you join us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Hey, let's start, Dave, maybe start with Ontario, and we're recording this podcast on April 10th, and we're awaiting the latest market performance report from iGaming Ontario to come down, which I believe, Dave, will give us a picture of the past 12 months of the market in Ontario. Maybe just start some general thoughts on 3 years and maybe a shortened version of the good, bad, and ugly of the market here.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was looking at the numbers yesterday, I think, and trying to figure out what it would be for the first 3 years. And it's going to be right around $7 billion in gross gaming revenue for the first 3 years in Ontario, which, tax dollar wise, that's, somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.4 billion. And those are incredible numbers. That was even startling to me. I was like, could it be that? And when you take the handy Excel file that iGaming Ontario gives us and just sum it up, that's what you get. So that number is incredible. So that struck me. The sheer number of operators we've talked about lots and sites is still huge. That other provinces haven't followed in 3 years. This also struck me. So that's something maybe others can pick up on. I mean, Alberta will get there, and we kind of always thought from the beginning of Ontario that they would be the second one. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement elsewhere, and maybe they're seeing some things around the world or in the United States that scare them off. But so I'm a little surprised about that. So those are kind of the high level things, and other people can pick up from that. But the numbers are still incredible. So I'm interested to see if they'll ever tail off or keep going up gradually, especially the casino numbers are off the charts.
Geoff, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for having me on. Always happy to do it. I'm a big fan of the show. And I will say, where I start with Ontario, looking back on it, is just thinking about how it was something of like a legislative miracle for this whole market to come together, if you think about it, because Ontario had been pursuing this private competitive market on its own separate track. This was not a federal undertaking, but at the same time, we were having those discussions in Ottawa about the decriminalization of single game sports betting. It was happening in parallel with Ontario's work on this iGaming market. And so it just so happens that you have that single game sports betting bill pass in the summer of 2021. The Ontario market then comes online in the spring of 2022, and you have that full assortment of gaming products ready to go right from the jump, including single game bets. And the funny thing about that happening is in Canada, we're now free to bet on single games. But the nature of sports betting is that everybody wants to bet parlays these days, at least recreationally. So it's kind of funny in that way. And, I look at the Ontario market and it's come together in a very seemingly seamless way. Of course, a ton of work going on behind the scenes to make it happen. But where we are today, to the consumer, it's all just happened sort of in this very smooth fashion. And so that's what when I look at Ontario, I think about it in that sort of way, just how it all came together that way. And then, as for other provinces, things like that, you could be forgiven for thinking, if you're just, the average sports bettor or casino player in another province, just thinking, Ontario just came together so quickly and so easily. But really, we know from what we've lived through that a lot more went into it, and that there are all these kind of policy considerations that have to be weighed, and that are weighing on the minds of lawmakers and all these other jurisdictions. And so that could account for some of the hesitancy to launch something Ontario like. And we're seeing that now play out again in Alberta as they just fired the starting gun officially with the introduction of that bill there recently.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Alberta a little bit more in a few minutes. Robyn, your thoughts on Ontario 3 years in?
Well, I mean, financially, it's obviously a pretty big success. I would like to see, like, they've done a lot. There's been a lot of calculations. I do love the new IGO monthly reporting. That is beautiful. So thanks to them for that. But I would like to see some calculations around maybe some of the negatives that may be going on behind the scenes, particularly in respect to responsible and problem gambling. One thing I have noticed is that the ARPPA, average revenue per player account, has gone up and up and up for the most part. It's been a little up and down of late, but since it started, I believe it was about $158, and now it's up in the high 2s to low 3s usually. I think it peaked at 331 last August. And if you look at, for example, the lower risk gambling guidelines, that goes way beyond what, in theory, people should be spending, especially if you consider that every account is not necessarily a separate player. Some of them have multiple accounts at multiple books. So that's something I would like to see quantified in some way. But, I think they've done a very good, as Geoff said, it was fairly seamless. They've built out a very successful market. I would just like to see more of a full picture at some point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Robyn. I think that is also a nice segue into kind of looking ahead and things that could be done better. And, we sit here, I think it's got to be closing on 8 months now since IGO announced that there was going to be a centralized self-exclusion program, and that IXUp and IC360 were going to create that program together. That hasn't happened yet. We know that Martha Otton last summer announced that she'd be stepping down as the head of iGaming Ontario at the end of 2024. That was extended until the end of March. My understanding is that Martha that followed through, and Martha left the organization at the end of March. A replacement hasn't been named yet. And I think, to your point, Robyn, the one thing that's concerned me about Ontario, and this is something that we've knocked around, I think the four of us in audio and in the newsletter and at conferences, but I think even going back to the days where the four of us would get together and have a drink at a reception before a conference, and that's the willingness of people to talk about this industry. And I'll say it again, it feels to me that people like Paul Burns and Amanda Brewer have been almost alone on an island when it comes to advocating for this industry in public forums. And once again, I tried to get, I reached out to the Attorney General of Ontario's office, Doug Downey's office, to get him on the podcast to talk about the 3rd anniversary. I was told he wasn't available, and that was tied to the provincial election. So I'll give him a bit of mulligan on that one. I've tried so many times to get someone from the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario to come on this podcast to talk. and once again tried to get Dr. Karen Schnar on the show, or Dave Phillips or Brent McCurdy or someone from the AGCO to talk about 3 years in, and was told by the communications folks at AGCO that wasn't possible. And again, I'd hoped to get Martha on the podcast, and we couldn't get our schedules in sync. But it's been a bit of a bear trying to get people from iGaming Ontario to come on this podcast. And I'd love to get your thoughts on your thoughts on that. And it kind of came up again for me, watching the CBS Sunday Morning last week, and Ted Koppel had a report on online sports betting in the U.S. and it was a pretty slanted article, to Robyn's point, about problem gambling, and they interviewed 3 gambling addicts, and it was a pretty sobering story, and didn't reflect very well on the gambling industry. And the American Gaming Association, which I was quite surprised, they didn't want to be interviewed by Koppel. They gave CBS a statement. And there's no other way to put it. I thought that was really lame. Robyn, maybe let to start with you there. Is this a case of me beating a dead horse, or do I make a valid point in kind of talking about this topic?
Oh, I think you make a valid point, for sure. I think there should be more transparency. I imagine it would be stressful to potentially, as a spokesperson for AGA or any of the other organizations, to put yourself out there, but I'm sure you should try, because I think it would reflect so much better on the industry if we showed to be part of the conversation.
Geoff?
Yeah, I agree. And I think too, it speaks to the tricky nature of the gambling industry, because at its core, it's really, a bit of an adversarial business. If you think about it, for companies to make money, the bettor must lose it. And talking about things like how much revenue is coming in, or how much is being bet, highlights just how much people might be gambling. And that is a tough thing to highlight as a big win. But one thing we do know is that there is, and there was, a big appetite for online gambling. We know this to be true. It's been borne out in the numbers. It was something that we had always suspected to be the case before more regulation came into being, and was able to substantiate that appetite. And now we've seen that it's grown. And it's the questions around how it's growing, if it's growing in a healthy and sustainable way. Those are the ones that are kind of now looming more over the industry to think about, because the argument at the start is always, it's happening, let's put guardrails around it, let's have a say over how things are going, let's make a bit of money for ourselves that we can then put to use for problem gambling programs and help of that sort. But then it becomes a question of, okay, how is this money being generated, and is it being generated in a way that is healthy for the player? And so that is a tough topic sometimes to communicate to people. But if you think about it, some of the issues that we might go into further on this podcast kind of stem from the lack of communication, and not communicating how things are, how things were, and how things should be.
Dave?
Yeah, exactly. And not being transparent, not coming out and spelling the benefits of the regulated market versus the unregulated market is a really lost opportunity for government officials, because it's not perfect. Anytime you get into legalizing a vice, you're going to run into some problems in society. So what they need to say is, what are you doing? What they're doing about it. And when they don't speak about it, it's tough to know those things. And, it's what probably all of us have advocated many times, but before that, responsible gambling has to be the first tier of any of this. It has to be the reason stated and emphasized over and over again. It should be on every website, how much money is going into responsible gambling programs from this, what you're doing to improve those things, what more you still want to do. Alberta has to, we're going to get into Alberta, I believe, in a bit, but Alberta has to start with that. They have to start there, and they have to also have centralized exclusion, self-exclusion before they open, because we've seen what's happened in Ontario by not having it. Now you have just a mess to try and figure that part of it out when you have 50 plus companies operating 80 plus sites. So obviously it's proven to be a bit of a technological hurdle. So before you open, make sure you have that in line.
Yeah, Robyn, I think if you're a stakeholder in this industry, you can certainly make the case that, gambling's not new. And I think that gets lost sometimes. It's almost like people thought that all of a sudden sports books had apps and people started to bet on sports. And we know that gambling's been around for forever and ever. It does feel to me though that the province, Ontario province, gets some credit for getting this market up and running with a legal framework. But at the same time, they've brought in a lot of money in tax revenue and haven't. I think there's a story that could be told, that to Dave's point, that yeah, we're earmarking so much money into gambling addiction or addiction programs and mental health programs. And I can't remember the last time outside of a conference where I've seen a government official say one word in this province about this industry.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, and I think it's particularly poignant because when they were talking about things to try and get the industry up and running, problem gambling and responsible gambling and player safety was one of the things that they talked about the most. So the fact that they're not continuing that conversation now that the industry is up, running, and obviously bringing in a whole lot of money, as Dave said, it's a lost opportunity, really.
Hey Geoff, I just want to finish with Ontario, and you were on a panel last week at the Osgood Gambling Law Certificate Program with Mike Miotis, a lawyer from Blake Castle's Graydon, I believe, and the topic of consolidation came up, and this is something that I think we also talked about on another panel I moderated at the same conference with Paul Burns and Amanda Brewer and Peter Zagletti. And that's just, when this market opened, I think from the days where people like yourself and Robyn and Dave appeared in our clubhouse shows, or we were, first got to know each other and covering this industry, is that there was already a consolidation watch. And how long was it going to be before the DraftKings and BetMGMs and Bet365s and FanDuels of the world started to swallow up the little fish? And as I mentioned at the top, we've seen, Fitzgerald has left the market, which is, fairly an operator with significant brand recognition. And I think there have been 3 or 4 other operators walk away from Ontario, but that consolidation really hasn't taken place. And Mike's thought on that panel was that we were going to see that start to happen. I just wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I did, and I mentioned some of this during the panel discussion, and I do have a few ideas about why we haven't seen a big reduction in the number of brands in the Ontario market. One of which is that the barrier to entry is relatively low, relative to what you see in the U.S. in particular. There isn't $1 million licensing fee you have to pay. There isn't a requirement to form a partnership with a casino operator, a brick and mortar casino operator, or a professional sports team, or any other entity that you would have to then share revenue with, or pay some kind of partnership fee to, or just have any obligation to, which you see in some U.S. states. So those are 2 things off your mind. The tax rate is relatively reasonable. You're not paying like the New York 51% of revenue. That is really prohibitive for smaller operators. And then you also have the fact that this is not, when we talk about iGaming in Canada, that's a catch-all term. It doesn't just mean online casino. It means online casino, online sports betting, poker, bingo, and the casino. But the online casino part of it is a really big reason why too. Some of these operators can remain going concerns in Ontario, because that business has better margins, frankly, than the sports betting business. You're not subject to the whims of a football team on Super Bowl Sunday coming through for you so you can pay the bills. You can still have that steady flow coming in from slots and table games. And you also don't need to have those table games. If you're doing live dealer, those dealers don't need to be in Ontario. They can be based in Vancouver or in New Jersey or wherever. So you can have those economies of scale, so to speak, for these operators. And so those are all things that I think are helping to keep a lot of consumer choice in the Ontario market, which I think is a good thing. And you mentioned Fitzdares, them going out of the market. They were kind of a curious fit for Ontario in general, where it's a really heavily online market, and their brand in the UK had always been these sort of posh clubs where gentlemen and ladies can come in and sit down and have a fine meal and place a nice wager, and they just couldn't get that off the ground in Ontario, so it was tough for them. It didn't really mix well with what they were doing. So a lot of reasons why we haven't seen, I think a lot of reasons why we haven't seen a big reduction in the number of operators. There could still be some people that aren't seeing the sort of success that they want, but I think there are reasons why we're seeing still just seeing a robust market in Ontario.
Hey Dave, just Fitzdares, it's interesting there. As Geoff mentioned, I interviewed William Woodhams when I went over to the Ice London event, I think 2 years ago, and met William and I think Tristan Wooten, one of their VPs at one of the Fitzdares clubs or whatever dinner clubs or whatever you call it, for lunch one day. And Jeff's bang on. It was, people in suits at lunchtime with the TVs on watching the ponies and placing a bet. And you've written in the newsletter lately, and we've talked about horse racing and betting in this new marketplace. And Paul Burns mentioned this on the Osgood Hall panel about that there's been a missed opportunity for casinos, land-based casinos in Ontario, to haven't been able to have partnerships with sports books. And I just wonder if Fitzdares might have been able to hang around if there'd been a bit of movement on that front and being able to have those partnerships.
Yeah, I think there's a market for some retail sports books and doing it the right way, doing sort of an upscale version of that, or a really nice place to go out and hang around with friends and possibly play some bets and watch some sports. Doesn't really exist here, and it's strange given the population of Ontario that some of that could exist. We all know, the challenge is most people are going to bet on their phones, and so why am I spending money on a retail space? But it's sometimes a different clientele, and if you do it the right way, you see it in Vegas all the time. People are attracted to those kind of facilities, and there's plenty of opportunity in the big cities in Ontario to have a few really good ones. So yeah, missed opportunity. I've said forever that horse racing wanted to be the partner, and certainly Woodbine is sitting on some great locations. I mean, they're connected to a casino at Woodbine Racetrack. They're just down the road from Pearson Airport. They still have their Greenwood facility in downtown Toronto. Mohawk is in Milton, in a booming part of the GTA. So I mean, there's some cases could be made for that would be a great spot for a retail sports book, and the horse racing people want it. So why not partner with them? Get more people out. They want to get people to the track. Seems like it could be something that would work. The OLG doesn't want to entertain it at this time. I've never really gotten a reason why, but I don't know. They don't want to do it.
Hey Rob, just going back quickly to Jeff's comment about online gaming, and we've seen a company like Betty that came in, and at the beginning, I think there was a lot of skepticism around a business that was kind of tailoring itself to women, or marketing itself to women. And Betty seems to be one of the little train that could in this marketplace. I think they're touting about 40,000 customers right now. There was just, I think, an announcement last week that they've secured additional funding to grow their business. There have been rumors out there that they do want to grow in the U.S., although that's a whole other animal to tackle given the limited number of states offering legal iGaming right now. But it does sound like, to Jeff's point, that there is room for iGaming specific operators out there. And I think sometimes we get lost. We look at sports betting as a shiny object. And when you look at Ontario, I think 85% of handle in the legal marketplace here is from iGaming customers.
I mean, I think that's pretty typical. And yeah, Betty is a good example of that. And they seem to be doing quite well, as you said. I think they just pulled another 15 million or something like that in funding.
Right.
And I know that they have plans. They've said they want to be the McDonald's of basically iCasino, where they want to, going forward, I think their plan is to break off into separate entities in different locations that are like a franchise basically of the main Betty brand, which now they've started in Ontario by bringing in one of their executives to be the new CEO of Betty Canada, basically. So yeah, there's definitely those opportunities in Ontario, but as you said, much harder in the US currently because of the patchwork way things, operate.
Let's get into Alberta, and I think it was 2 weeks ago that the provincial government there finally unveiled the iGaming Alberta Act. Last week there was debate, I believe, in the House or the legislature to kind of start the ball rolling. Tom Nightingale wrote about it in Canadian Gaming Business. Dave wrote about it in the Friday edition of the newsletter. Dave, I may just start from you. Like, if there were one or two lessons that the Alberta government could take from what's happened in Ontario, what would those lessons be as they look towards launching either at the end of this year or early in 2026?
Beyond what we already all mentioned about responsible gambling being the key to it, and centralized self-exclusion, it's got to be a part of it. Beyond that, I think it's what Geoff talked about. It's entry to market. It's low cost entry to market. If part of your game is you're trying to get people away from gray market operators, then the way to do it is to follow the Ontario model, and then to, lower reasonable tax rate, reasonable licensing fees, and it's controversial, but allowing these gray market operators to continue on the way they've been doing business seems to have worked in Ontario, and I think it probably would work in Alberta. But those kind of things, I think, are, having no cap. We've talked about that, having no cap on the market. They're already talked about they're going to have a casino component. So that brings more people into the market, as Geoff and Robyn already were talking about. And it's the one piece I never understand why online casinos are more popular in the United States, because you would think that the states would be interested in drawing as many operators as, whatever their cap limit was, or drawing as many people into the market as they possibly could to regulate it, but they don't seem to follow that logic. But I think Alberta will. So those are the keys to me is if you're doing this to supposedly better protect consumers and to provide a better responsible gambling approach to this, then you have to draw as many people into the market as possible.
Hey, Robyn, what is there anything specifically aside from a self-exclusion program that Alberta could do in terms of on the problem gambling issue?
Well, I mean, there's lots, I would say, but I think one of the main things is maybe not, like, they just cut funding to problem gambling programs in Alberta because they weren't direct service. So maybe not do that would be a good place to start. Otherwise, I mean, with the proposed iGaming Act, one of the big critiques I've seen so far from the debates that have happened already is that it's really like a shell. There's not a lot of details or specifics. So, they might want to consider putting in some of the regulations and some of the plans for how much money might be put towards RG and PG and where it'll be spent or how it'll be handled. Those are certainly something, but they haven't done that as yet. And that seems to be where things are where they're catching some friction with the other parties in the legislature, NDP specifically. But
Hey, Geoff, I do wonder too, like the Ontario, there's a lot of flack towards operators around advertising and marketing when the industry opened here in Ontario, and the AGCO did address that, what I guess about a year into the market. Again, I just wonder if there's an opportunity here to put a little bit more teeth in the rules around advertising, and even having a strong responsible gaming messaging campaign, either initiated by the government or the AGLC or this new Alberta iGaming Corporation, but having something that's very, very public and provides a lot of information and education when the legal market does open there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think Robyn's bang on in that the regulations will really be where the rubber hits the road for this market. If you look at the bill that was laid out, Bill 48 by the Alberta government, it sketches out a very Ontario-like structure for, the back end, so to speak, of this market. And that makes sense because Ontario's model was, when they launched it, a brand new thing. No provincial government had ever tried this sort of thing. And this model has already been through a test in the courts. It was put, it was challenged by the Mohawk Council, Ganawake. A Ontario Superior Court judge found that this model meets the threshold, that conduct and manage threshold for a provincial government to offer online gambling. And so Alberta taking that model and putting it in legislation makes a lot of sense because this model so far has been proven to be legal. This is how you can do it. So that makes a lot of sense. And then once you get past that, you can get into the regulations, and that's where you can start to differentiate from what Ontario does, or try to emphasize what you're doing differently, perhaps from what Ontario did. One point, as you've noted, that the minister made a big point of was that we're going to launch with centralized self-exclusion as opposed to trying to implement it after. That's a good thing, of course. They could do different things on the advertising side. One thing that is interesting that, and this in Ontario doesn't really get communicated a whole lot, but I think I've heard it mentioned on this podcast, for example, is that the contracts that Ontario iGaming operators are signing with iGaming Ontario actually include a provision that requires them to spend a certain amount of dollars on responsible gambling programs. And that's not something that gets a whole lot of play out in the public, but there are contractual requirements for them to spend money on these sorts of things. And so that's something that Alberta could obviously do now through its contracts, or however it wants to structure its deals with operators. So that's something you can do through not even through regulation. That's just a business deal essentially with the province that these companies would have to make. And then furthermore on the regulations, you could get into different things. Like you could get into I'm sure that the conversation is going to be had about whether or not to permit athlete endorsements of products, or whether it should be changed in an Ontario-like way where they can only speak if they're speaking about RG tools, that sort of thing. But I think, it's really going to be in the regulations where I think we could see some differentiation between Alberta and Ontario if they want to go that route, or if they don't want to go that route, they can also just go with more Ontario-like regulations too. But I think that is really going to be an interesting thing once we finally do see those rules when they're eventually proposed.
Hey Dave, I think I've read or heard something about affiliate marketers, and that Alberta, the rules might be a little looser than they were in Ontario. I just wondered, have you read or heard something similar? And if so, what are your thoughts on that? And Robyn and Geoff can weigh in here too.
Yeah, they might be better to talk about this one because I haven't seen anything, Steve. So I'll pass it. I'll pass it to them.
Yeah, Robyn, have you heard anything about that?
I haven't seen anything specific. I was looking around today to see if I actually downloaded the bill and was searching through it to see if there's anything there, and looking online to see anything specific, but I haven't yet. So I don't know what to say about that. Although I guess if you've heard hints of it being different, it might be that they're not going to make, talks of bonuses not be allowed. But
Hey Jeff, do you think I know there was a lot of confusion in Ontario when the market opened. I think the AGCO and IGO basically put the operators in charge of policing affiliates, and that I think that led to some confusion and led to some fines in the early days of the marketplace. And I know the affiliates haven't been real happy with what's happened in Ontario. Do you think that maybe there could be a bit of a loosening of the rules in Alberta?
I'm not sure. We'll have to see where they eventually land on it, but it's possible that you could have affiliates have to register separately from the sportsbook operator, so you would have both accountable in different ways. Because as you noted in Ontario, operators were being held accountable for the actions of affiliates, and I'm sure that can be a bit awkward for both parties. So Alberta could potentially go a different way with it if they want to. The communication around bonuses was a thing that created some issues on day one in Ontario, because those sign up bonuses are useful tools for operators to bring in customers. And so we'll see what Ontario does. One thing I was really I would say impressed by was the rhetoric used by Minister Nally when they were announcing this market, and saying stuff like, we're not trying to create new gamblers, we're trying to essentially capture existing activity, which is a really interesting thing to say, because you're going to have potentially all these new faces come in and be regulated and want to attract customers to them. And so how do they pull in customers to their business without finding new customers? Will there be new gamblers created that way? So I was interested to hear that kind of language used, because one thing that is goes back to what we were talking about, the CBS segment and the industry defending itself in some ways, is that advertising is a tool in converting people from and transitioning them from the unregulated market to the regulated one. You need to tell them that there are regulated options out there, that they can move from a book that's going to flout the rules to one that obeys by the rules, obeys the rules, and also will transfer a bit of money to the province for public programs and that sort of thing. And so that's the tricky part about advertising, is that in Ontario and other places, when it becomes a bit much, it's very noticeable, and people are very loud about their opposition to it, because they're totally entitled to have that take on it. But then from the industry's perspective, they need to let people know that they're here, because when you have this pre-existing gray market that's so large and that's been going on for so long, you have to explain why things are changing, and part of that explanation is advertising. And so how do you strike that balance? How do you ensure you're not going overboard? How do you ensure you're not just beating people over the head with stuff, or trying to induce them in a way that's potentially problematic? These are all conversations that are going to be had in and around the Ontario or the Alberta regulations when we do finally see them.
Yeah, and I think again, it's this industry is now operating as a legal industry, and I think they should be able to conduct business just like any other legal industry. But yeah, I think it probably is up to the regulators to work with those operators and put the guardrails in place. And there's always going to be addiction in an industry. Let's call them vice industries, whether it's gambling or cannabis or liquor, but are the proper procedures or guardrails in place so that you can lessen that impact as much as possible. And that's a whole other podcast to talk about that. Hey, I want to wrap up, and I'll start with you, Robyn. Just kind of, the three of you kind of have different. You and Jeff are obviously following closely what's going on in the U.S., also following what's going on in Canada. But when you look at the U.S. right now, I mean, man, oh man, I mean, it's we joked off before we started recording just how much is going on in the U.S. right now. I think the last week it was announced that Hawaii is probably going to become the 40th state to legalize sports wagering, which kind of came out of left field. Geoff was joking at the Osgood Hall program about the Massachusetts Gaming Commission and what's going on right there right now. And we know last week they were dealing again with the exclusion and VIP programs and limiting. Sorry, we see Kalshi appears to be in court on a daily basis in a new state, and very interesting that they hired Sarah Slane, who's been around the gaming industry for a long time. That Kalshi hired her last week in an executive role. I guess the question for me, Robyn, is what stories kind of resonate most loudly with you right now, and what is it you're following really closely?
Well, definitely the prediction markets. I think that's something that is we're gonna hear about it for a while, I think, because well, it's potentially a huge mess and a lot of stuff. I mean, I think the CFTC hearing is at the end of this month to start to talk about it. But I mean, there's so many states now that have come out with cease and desists, and although Nevada has ruled to Kalshi's favor most recently, so that's definitely something. I also sweeps casinos are getting a lot of notoriety, I guess, throughout the U.S. And then the other thing I think that is probably going to come up more often is related to the tariffs and also just Trump's general attitude towards Canada, because I mean the tariffs are creating their own problem, whether it be that gaming companies are losing, stock market pricing, or but there's also the effect on like casinos that are just across the borders, or even Las Vegas. Apparently they've seen a huge like 70% less of Canadians heading to Vegas. So I think those things are that might be like a lower sort of smoldering story that's going to happen along the side of other things. But I think it could be more interesting than I would have originally expected.
Yeah, I think Porter last week announced they're canceling flights to Las Vegas from Ottawa to Las Vegas this summer, which is pretty dramatic. And then Geoff, I can't remember if it was at the conference or in a conversation I had or something I saw, but just the conversation again about the impact on the tariffs, and what you could have a supplier in the U.S. or you could have a Canadian company that builds a casino game using American parts or American labor, and it was a really convoluted explanation, but it made sense, because as soon as you bring made in the U.S. or a U.S. part in the fold, it puts a layer of complexity to what's going on with the way Trump wants to run the economy, whatever the hell that is. So yeah, Geoff, just again, you're kind of a 5-tool analyst following everything going on in the gaming industry. Like what kind of consumes most of your day right now?
Well, today I did spend some time with the Massachusetts Gaming Commission. They had a brief update on their work on sports bettor limiting, which is that they're in need of some help on analyzing all the data they've collected, and then also in need of more data. They have more questions that want to be answered, but that is something that it's a bit more obscure. It's I'm sure that there's a big hashtag gambling Twitter sphere out there that loves to rail about limits, and it seems everyone on Twitter is limited in some way. So we'll see where that goes. I am interested in that just because it kind of goes to the heart of gambling, which is that if nobody can win, why would people gamble? So I'm keeping an eye on that for sure. But I do think the big one for me right now is this Kalshi prediction market conversation, because if you look at it, it really threatens the entire status quo of legal sports betting in the US right now, which is state level regulation of sports betting. And if there is suddenly a federally regulated entity that can offer sports betting in all 50 states floating above them, and the offerings right now are kind of basic, but I'm sure they're working on firming that up and getting into more interesting stuff. They can take bets in Utah And DraftKings or FanDuel or any other state-regulated entity could only dream of doing the same because Utah has very strict anti-gambling laws. And so if you look at the decision we saw in Nevada earlier this week, that judge, Kalshi had gone to the Nevada District Court seeking an injunction, a temporary injunction, and basically just trying to stop the Nevada gaming regulators from shutting them down in the state, which they had sent a cease and desist letter to the company. And the judge's decision on this opening salvo, you could say, and what I'm sure is going to be a longer legal fight, was that, if you have issues with these sports and political contracts, you got to take it up with the feds. You have to go to the CFTC or talk to Congress because that's their jurisdiction, which, that is a very significant thing to say, even so early on in the legal process, because, you can infer from that right now that like Kalshi's okay to keep doing what it's doing. And, of course, it's not just Kalshi. They're also helping Robinhood offer on the back end, which is really driving a lot of that trading volume for them because Robinhood is such a popular trading platform in the US. And then you have crypto.com and potentially now state regulated sportsbook operators taking a longer look at whether they should be doing something similar because, if they're locked out of California and Texas right now, but Kalshi and others can be there in these huge untapped markets, how can they just cede the field to them on that? So this is a huge story, and it's taking a lot of twists and turns, and it dates back a long way too. Like, Kalshi was in legal fights last year over its election related contracts. It had to really work just to get those off the ground, and they proved to be pretty popular. And there is a Canadian connection there as well, in that arguably the most popular prediction market is Polymarket, and Polymarket is accessible in most of Canada. There are Canadians who wager on things using Polymarket. I think it was the Wall Street Journal who, when they did one of their write-ups on it, quoted a Canadian saying that they had made some serious money trading contracts in and around some of the political craziness. And I think it was some other stuff too, or in the US last year, how they had managed to make some profitable trades. So it is a really big story. There are a lot of other things to think about, but if we're talking just purely sports betting, this potentially federally regulated way of offering what is de facto sports wagering. Maybe it's not legally sports betting, which is how it's still going, but there are some big potential consequences there that I'm spending more and more of my time on covering.
Hey Dave, just give the last word to you, but just quickly, Geoff mentioned the election, and we're in a period right now where March Madness just ended, the Masters just ended on the weekend, but yet it seems, the federal election going on in Canada right now, it takes up as much oxygen as seems those events when it comes to wagering these days in the Ontario market.
Yeah, and interesting, when Geoff talks about the instability of the U.S. market, it seems like the Canadians have just kind of figured out a bunch of stuff, and it was like made logical sense. So, like, can you bet on elections? Sure, you can. Can you have online casinos? Sure, you can. Can you have as many people as you want in your market? Sure, you can. Can you charge them a reasonable tax rate? You sure can. Can you try and get them not to entice people by saying free bets and bonuses? You sure can. So, I at the beginning of my journey of all this, I was a little skeptical about some of the Ontario regulations, and now I see that much of this makes sense. And I can't get my head around why the states can't just look and see they do it over there, and they're doing it in a province of 15, 16 million people. So it's not a tiny market. It's a big market, and it seems to be wildly successful. Why don't we do that? And that's the thing that's kind of the takeaway for me in all this is so many of these things that they fight about and dither about. And I was just like years and years and years of why they are doing this and not doing that, when you could just, I think you eliminate some of those, other options, or you lessen them by just saying, yeah, you can bet on elections here. So go ahead. You can, you have lots of choice. You can bet at Betty, or you can choose to go to FanDuel. So a lot of those things are, so my takeaway as years go on is there's so much logic here. They're just here. It just yeah, you can just do it. But in the States, they fight about this stuff and what's legal, what's not. And the states get involved. There's cease and desist. There's just seems like they could use a little more common sense.
I've often said that the gambling industry in North America is incredibly well served by the journalists who cover it, and at a time where we've seen a lot of shrinking of media in, I guess, legacy or traditional media, which I think the four of us all have some background with over the years. Uh, as I said, this industry gets very well covered, and these three people are at the top of that group. Dave Briggs is the author of the Gaming News Canada newsletter when he's not doing his full-time gig with Ontario Racing. Geoff Zochodne is the senior news analyst for the covers, and Robyn McNeil is the lead news writer for not just bonus.com, but I think there's a whole bunch of bonus domains these days, Robyn.
There is, yeah.
Listen, thanks to the the three of you for doing this. Great insight as always. It's always great to have a conversation with journalists. I may be a tad biased on that one, but very grateful for the three of you to be here today and be part of this Gaming News Canada Show podcast.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
That's it. That's it for this episode of the GNCS. As always, you can find our podcast on Substack. They're also available on the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel and on the various podcast platforms. You can also follow Dave Briggs and Robyn and Geoff on the various social media platforms as well. And if you're someone who's new to the gambling industry, I highly recommend that you find those people and read their coverage. Thanks again to Dave Briggs, Robyn McNeil, and Geoff Zochodne for joining us today, and we will see everybody again very soon.